The institution of the new Charities Regulatory Authority is an event of great significance for all of us and for the country. And I believe that it has been very widely welcomed in this sector, and that welcome isn't just wanting to touch up the image of charities following recent negative criticisms and scandals. The overwhelming body of charity organisations genuinely welcomes the emergence of a clear regulatory framework as an important instrument to foster transparency, to ensure public confidence, and to foster best practice. The charities sector should not be stigmatised for the misdeeds of a few. When the image of the charity sector is undermined, society is weakened. Society needs the charity sector. It needs a strong civil society. It needs responsible citizenship, which plays an active and positive role in responding to human needs. And the application of the norms of the regulator are also an education, they're a formative process. In the Catholic Church, for example, the norms set out by the National Board for Safeguarding Children serve not just as a mechanism for monitoring and reviewing, and where needed identifying non-compliance, but the very mechanisms of compliance had a vital didactic role. And it's important to us to remember that charities are not entering this process under duress. For a long time, there's been a clear desire to be in a lead position regarding good internal governance and financial management. Having clear norms and common reporting standards which act as benchmarks will be of great help to the entire charity sector. And the task is not just that of identifying those who are not complying, although this is of vital importance. The title is to lead the entire sector as a whole to best practice. The regulator will obviously set out to verify codes of practice regarding governance and financial management, but it's always important to keep the big picture in mind. Better government and management are there to ensure that the charity sector and civil society are facilitated in carrying out their mission. And we should remember two basic principles. Rules are there to defend the more vulnerable and to restrain any tendency towards arrogance of the more powerful. That's why we have rules. And secondly, we must remember that while rules are necessary, they'll only remain a naked skeleton unless they're covered in flesh and blood by solidarity and integrity. Now, the term charity is obviously of particular interest to me as a Christian leader, because charity is an essential dimension of the Christian faith. Christianity is a religion called to witness to the love of God, Caritas Dei, revealed in Jesus Christ. Fortunately, in many areas, especially in the English language, the term charity has become somewhat devalued. How often do we hear it said that people need justice and not charity? Charity has been debased into an equivalent of handouts and do-goodism. And for many, charity is linked with a do-goodism which looks after people's short-term needs without looking at the root causes of deprivation. And it's looked on as someone else's do-gooding rather than a response to the rights and the interests of the recipient who should be in the driving seat. Charity, it's said, is not the answer to structural injustices which are at the roots of inequalities, deprivation, and lack of opportunity in society. Now, as a religious leader, I have to ask myself, is that a correct understanding of Christian charity? Without wanting to preach at you this morning, allow me for a moment to reflect on the concept of Christian charity and ask in what way it might bring added value to social action in general. That might help us to answer more clearly questions about the specific characteristics of the charity sector and how we can best foster those specific characteristics. I just draw attention to two of the characteristics from Scripture of God's love. God's love is first of all gratuitousness. It doesn't set conditions. Take the story of the prodigal son. He comes back home to find that his father is there waiting for him with open arms. The son had prepared his little negotiating speech. Lord, I have sinned against you. But he doesn't have the time to use it. The son is just welcomed. That's what gratuitousness is. And the other is superabundance. The love of God surprises you. It's so generous that it should turn you head over heels. I chose those two examples because they don't easily match with the patterns of thought of the market-driven consumer society, in which everything is precisely measured. If the label says 16 ounces, you won't get 1 ounce more. You might get 1 ounce less. But if we truly lived, if we had to live in a society like that, where you only get what you pay for and nothing beyond, if we lived that, none of us would be here today. We are all here today because someone loved us. Someone gave us a break. Someone had enough trust in us to give us a chance, and perhaps even invested in us, just because they recognized who we were. The world needs the values that create generosity, and the economy needs the values that create generosity. The values that make you care about another person, even if that other person is weak, that motivate you to make an investment in people, an investment which is not linked to personal interest or gain. That is what is most basic in the charity sector, and which must be always the inspiration of our activities. Society needs the values that create generosity. The word charity then is not just about delivering services. It's about enabling people to experience or to re-experience the richness of their own identity, the richness of their own humanity. Pope Francis is a master in the use of symbolic gestures. And for me, the most striking gesture of Pope Francis was when he saw a young man whose face was completely covered in sores. The Pope didn't do what most of us would probably have done, kindly greeted him from a safe distance, or simply asked him, or perhaps his doctors, what disease has he got? What's the prognosis for it? No, Pope Francis stopped and kissed the man. The basic ethic of all charitable institutions must be a basic ethic of humanity. That ethic is the most challenging ethic of all, and one which all of us, me included, continuously fail. But the fundamental ethics of humanity is the one without which all other ethical projects will fall flat. Now, what does that say to us who belong to the varied contemporary charity sector? Charity sector is very varied. I was just saying to somebody coming in, some are big businesses, some are still where the accounts are done on the kitchen table. How do we bring all these together? Is it realistic to think that love can be organised and become an ordered service to the community in which we live? Is love not at most a possible added-on element to the work of management of charitable organisations? And not all sectors of the charity world would feel that they can be governed by such a radical ethics of disinterested. In today's society, many charities are de facto non-profit businesses which deliver a social good. Many bodies find that being not-for-profit limited company is the most appropriate legal framework within which to fulfill civil legal requirements. And we all know that when it comes to looking for a new director or CEO of a charity, the process of selection is very much the same process of open competition as for any job, looking at the business competence of the person and not at their religious motivation or personal commitment and idealism. If you read the job offers in The Economist any week, you'll find that the non-governmental sector offers some of the highest salaries. But we also have to remember that CEOs and directors of charities carry huge responsibilities in the area of financial management, human and employment relations, very often commensurate with leaders in large businesses. And the question we have constantly to ask ourselves is, can charities become more like businesses and still maintain their identity? And how do charities avoid cross-contamination? At the same time, we see that today companies engage with charitable and development organisations in a variety of positive ways. The concept of corporate social governance is an old one which has developed over the years. And most companies today consider it important to be considered good corporate citizens, not concerned only with unqualified growth and maximum profit alone. Some countries like the United States, the tax regime fosters large donations to the corporate sector to enhance projects of social responsibility. When I lived abroad and talked about social responsibility, I always referred to a well-known Irish firm, which is just the other side of the river, and reminded people that the first swimming pool in Dublin, public swimming pool, and the oldest children's creche were both founded by the firm Arthur Guinness. And Guinness also provided housing for its employees, still today invests in bright young people who might not have had educational opportunity. Business can make an immense contribution to social progress. So in this changed landscape, where do we find the specific characteristics of the charity sector? Government, business and civil society each have their own place, and today interact more and more. What do we mean by civil society, and what is its special contribution, and that of voluntarism, as opposed to business and government? The term NGO is one that I am never been totally happy with. I have no problem with NGOs, because I feel the term tends to place government as the prime mover in all social activity. Rather than foster a real concept of subsidiarity, the term NGO somehow implies a tendency to look on everyone as being subsidiary and even subservient to government. While NGOs then at times can become efficient delivery of social programs, governments might look on them rather as a cheaper way to deliver social programs. NGO can unwittingly become the privatized arm of government, with government outsourcing certain services through them. And this is not always without cost to the integrity and the specific vision and mandate of an NGO. The distinctions become even more blurred when, for example, NGOs and charities draw most of their funding from government. Charities, which are the flavour of the month, will most likely attract more money from the business sector, but there may be others which really need the funding. And the perennially valid warning about no free lunches should keep charities attentive to safeguarding their real mission when interacting with business. When governments are the sole supporters of any charity, then government inevitably will want to manage them, and the real sense of civil society could be undermined. Civil society is not simply an extension of government. It's another component of a participative society. We need, particularly today, a strong ethics of civil society. Any system of norms must be based on a system of ethics. Ethics must, above all, have an independent foundation. Ethics is not an ideology or just a pragmatic program of ideas. Ethics is not about finding answers which help us to feel good. The very nature of ethics is that personal responsibility must be at its centre. We are responsible for the foreseeable consequences of our acts. Independent personal responsibility is always at the heart of ethical behaviour. Ethics is about the way we responsibly and authentically structure our own personal behaviour. It's about the application of ethical principles to the decisions we make. Remember, in the long term, a just society is attained not just by rules and norms, but by people who live justly and with integrity. And in corporate governance also, the concept of personal responsibility is central. It remains central. When things go wrong, it's very easy to say, I didn't know, and the blame must be with someone else. I was stunned on the occasion of the scandals of child sexual abuse in the church to encounter what I call the baking the cake culture. Oh, I only put in the sugar, he put in the flour, and none of us are responsible because we weren't there when the cake was put in the oven. We are all responsible for the foreseeable consequences of our actions. We're all responsible for the foreseeable consequences of our omissions. Real corporate responsibility can only be constructed on the foundation of an acute sense of personal responsibility. To paraphrase what I said earlier, rules and norms are necessary, but they can remain a naked skeleton unless they're covered in the flesh and blood of personal integrity. And personal responsibility involves looking into our own heart and conscience, but also looking at, and not being afraid to look at, and not be afraid to recognize where things are not working well. Ethics must be value generated. But the enforcement of ethical standards can often be attained best not through preaching and moralizing, but by establishing a down-to-earth legal and governance framework which makes ethical behaviour less likely and less attractive. In the mid-90s, I remember, the World Bank drew attention to the enormous social and economic cost of corruption in Latin American countries. But the conventional wisdom at the time was that international organisations have no right to intervene in the internal affairs of independent sovereign states. So noisy anti-corruption campaigns were not going to be on the agenda. The World Bank approached the question proposing something much more simple: packages of technical reform of the tax systems. The existing systems were so complex and involved, and they involved so many passages, and therefore so many hands to be greased, that the simplification of the tax system made the system much more efficient and greatly reduced the possibility of corruption. Ethics do not always require preaching and moralizing to be applied. And just as those governments at that time felt that they were above external evaluation, the fact that charities and civil society, or indeed religious bodies, are separate from government doesn't mean that they are exempt from control and reporting on their expenditure. And that's the real progress of the establishment of the Charities Regulator. Such regulation will naturally have to reflect on the specific status and the variety within civil organisations, but the fact of any legitimate difference between the legal obligations of civil society and business doesn't mean that civil society do not have legal obligations. But above all, they have moral obligations which are just as binding as legal ones. Ethics requires governance and regulation and enforcement because we live in a world of human beings. And where we live in a world of human beings, corruption can always appear on the order of the day. It should also be noted, as I alluded in my text earlier, one of the most common forms of corruption is inefficiency and sloppy management, because that inefficiency and sloppy management robs people, especially the poorest and the most vulnerable, of the quality services which are their democratic due and for which they pay anyway. So inefficiency is a form of corruption, and norms are there to see that we use our resources properly. Transparency involves allowing all stakeholders to know their rights, to be able to claim their rights and entitlements. A survey done at the turn of the century, again by the World Bank, called Voices of the Poor, was the widest ever consultation of the poor and how they viewed their needs. Interesting, the poor identified as the single most significant factor that would help them rise from poverty. What was the word that they used? Voice. They found that often the very institutions which were institutionally constituted to defend their rights, police, local authorities, social services, were often the ones who deprived them of their rights and that left them then with no recourse. So voice is extremely important in the things we do to help people understand their entitlements rather than simply trying to do things for them. Rather than enter into the technical challenges about accountability, setting benchmarks about the manner in which charities spend their money on such questions as administration, I've tried maybe to bring us to a deeper sense of what the charity sector and civil society really mean. The concept of voluntarism and gratuitousness are vital for any living society. But they're not just abstract concepts. They represent the commitment, the generosity of so many individuals in our society who take up the responsibility of being concerned about the marginalized and about those who otherwise would fall through the networks of care and solidarity. Society has an obligation to recognize the service of the men and women who take on responsibility for the public good, right down from those who voluntarily take on the heavy responsibility of being members of boards of governance, right down to the day-to-day hands-on work of those who care. All play an irresponsible role in making our society more human, and they all help us to understand really what being human means. Thank you.